I think this sled has seen better days. My milling machine has seen better days too. This machine has a trapezoidal gib on the saddle. It's sort of a combination between the dovetail and the gib all in one piece. But when I got the machine, it was not in one piece. So that was a big problem, but it was good enough that the first thing I did with the mill was make a new one. And that got the machine to a usable state. But because the thing had been used with a broken gib for who knows how long, and just the fact that this machine's 75 years old, there's a lot of wear on the saddle. And so that's something I want to take care of. I'd like to rebuild this machine. The column is not quite as bad, but it still does. The table is probably in the best shape out of the three axes, but it does get a little bit tight right at the end. And maybe it's a little bit of a fool's errand, but I'd like to rebuild this machine. I like the form factor of it and the history of it. That's a big job, and there's a lot of work to do before that, and the first thing to do is to make a good hand scraper. I've done some scraping on the channel, and this is what I've used. This was actually what I made for doing the replacement gib. It's a carbide end mill ground off to a radius and just stuck into a piece of scrap. And this is pretty inadequate for doing decent scraping. I've been doing a lot of reading about what makes a good hand scraper, and I think I want to use part of one of these sled runners for it. It'll give me the chance to do something useful with this that keeps the original character of it, but makes something really useful too. Lengthwise, you want something that's going to be comfortable to hold with sort of your eye over the end of the scraper. Kind of figuring the start of my handle is going to be about there. And it'll also let me, if I need to, grab this part or drill and tap and put a pad here for pushing against it with my hip. I want it to end kind of somewhere around here. There is actually an existing hole here, and I kind of wonder if I can utilize that. Kind of laughing at this because I edge found the vise and then put this crusty piece of hand-forged steel in here. I'm like, oh, I'm going to measure the vise jaws so I can get it perfectly centered on this thing that isn't straight in any dimension and it's random, and yeah, it's really close to being an inch. It's 1/1000th over an inch. They don't make them like that anymore. This is a 1/4 28. It's like an M6 fine thread for you metric folks. Doing a fine thread on this because it's going to end up being very thin. Want a few threads in there. Valiant effort, but it looks like there's a little bit right there that didn't get threads. Looks like that hole wasn't originally centered, so maybe the scraper's going to be right about there. It might seem a little silly cleaning rust off of metal I'm going to machine away anyway, but the rust is very abrasive, and I found that it dulls tools very quickly, in addition to being hard on the machines. So this just saves me time sharpening tools later. This piece is a lot thicker than I need it to be, so I'm going to start taking it down to the thickness I need. I'm going to use the shaper for this because I want to use the shaper. I have to run this across sideways rather than running along it because I'm going to have to do it in a couple stages. And just because of the length of it, I wouldn't be able to clamp it in the vise if it was the other way. I've got an initial cleanup done on that. There are some artifacts from where I moved it. Considering I'm referencing off this, that's no surprise. So on the second side, I'm going to do shorter sections, try to average that out a little bit. Flipped it again, did another pass on the first side. I'm still getting some little inconsistencies, but each time they get a little smaller, so I'm just going to keep flipping it, doing it again, working down. I'm going to shorten up the feet on this and do a finish pass. I did end up with some artifacts there where I stepped it over. There's a little bit of a twist in this, so I think that's sort of inevitable, but that was probably not the best way to do this, but it was good practice trying to move it, pick it up. Kind of gives me an idea of what my limitations in doing that are. It looks worse through the camera than it does in real life, and it looks worse than it feels. But that's nothing that's going to affect how this works. The next thing to do is to make a little pocket here for the carbide insert. I want this to be a little deeper at the back than at the front, so when it clamps down nicely on the front. I've got this set up at a 2-degree angle. This doesn't need to be critical or super precise, so I just did it with parallel and a protractor. Got it about right. Got a little bit of a springboard situation here, so this will be a lot of light cuts. One of the things I'm struggling with, because this isn't on parallels, is making sure that it's straight in the vise. I just did a real light cut, but it's deeper on this side than it is on this side. Because there's a little radius on this insert, it could tend to rock in there, so I'm just going to I've got this set up to cut the angle on the back side here, and we'll just I should have just filed this in the first place. It's not a precision feature, and because I didn't clean up the sides on this, it's really hard to get it straight in the vise. I'm tapping this for an M6 screw because I couldn't find a 1/4 28 flathead screw. Gives me a little bit finer thread than a 1/4 20. So far I like the way this feels, but I want to do a handle on here for when I'm holding it like that. I'm going to do this basically like a knife scale, so I just want to dust this off and get a flat surface. I generally don't like to use pallets unless I'm making something like fire. If you keep your eyes peeled, occasionally you find a piece on one that's pretty interesting. Looks like it has a very broad and almost imperceptible grain to it. Here's a piece of oak for comparison. It's very hard. I'm thinking it's probably something tropical, but I really have no idea what. Some sort of tree wood, maybe a truffula. At any rate, it should make a pretty nice handle. I sandblasted this to get it nice and clean, get any oil and remaining rust off it. So this one's going to butt up against here. The one on the other side will line up there. I think this is the first time I've poured epoxy on anything on my channel. Makes me feel like a reel maker. I had this great idea that I would make the clamp while the shaper is working on the rest of the scraper, but I can't take this to dimension because I need the parallels that are in the shaper right now. While I've got the shear tool in here, I'm just going to clean this up. It's purely aesthetic. I just like the surface finish better than the end mill marks. Now I'm going to take this side down to size. If you're an experienced hand scraper, you know I still need to hone this blade a little more, but making a machine to do that will be a future project. If only there was a way you could get YouTube to let you know when I post a new video. This will be good enough to try out for now. I should probably explain what this thing's actually used for those that don't know. I've got a little blue on the surface plate there and just a piece of scrap cast iron that I use for practicing scraping, testing them out. So you just rub it in the blue a little bit. And now I can see where the high spots are. And then with the scraper, you just knock off the high spots. This is something that's going to take some practice for me. Now that I'm actually using this thing, it does feel a little bit long, but it's easier to make it shorter than it is to make it longer. I took off about that much. Feels way better now. So the length from the front of the scraper to the handle, about 28 centimeters, about a little under a foot. Overall length, 44 centimeters, 17 inches. It's an inch wide, 25 millimeters, 3/16 of an inch thick. That's like 4.5 millimeters. Same on the clamp. I feel like this is one of those instances where you have a vision for something and it ends up coming out way better than you thought it would. But I'll take that. I like it when that happens.